So it looks like it's about 8:30, so I guess we'll get started. Thank you guys for getting up this early to talk to me or talk with me about websites. My name is Calvin Keaton. I'm a product planner on the Windows Azure team. I typically focus on application platform, but today I'm here to talk to you about Windows Azure websites and web hosting. I tend to like these things to be interactive, so we're going to go through a deck. I'm going to do a demo, but if you got any questions, feel free to chime in. Happy to have a conversation rather than just do a presentation. Got a deck that I'm going to talk a little bit about how we built Windows Azure websites, what we built it for, how to use it, and a little bit of a demo I'm going to show you. We're going to do a little source control, some versioning, show you how to do an SSL cert, a few other things. But as I said, let's have this be a conversation. If you've got anything you'd like to dig into or any particular questions, feel free to chime in with them. Fair enough? Okay. I think I just covered all that. So as we think about why we build a hosting solution like Windows Azure Websites, there's really sort of two categories of problems that we think about. The first is an IT category of problems. Essentially, how do you build and maintain a robust hosting infrastructure, whether that's something you do yourself, something you deliver as a service, something that comes from the cloud, or something that maybe is delivered from your internal IT shop. Infrastructure is hard, and it's expensive, and having things that make that process easier is always a good thing. The other category of problems are really more developer-focused, right? This is really around, how do you have a robust hosting infrastructure that you really don't have to worry about, that as a developer, you can publish directly to your infrastructure, you can manage versioning from your infrastructure, you can really do the work of coding without having to worry about sort of the baseline infrastructure that your code lives on. And so these are the two sort of categories of problems that we thought about as we built Windows Azure Websites. And really what we thought about this is PaaS for the modern web. So some notion of a PaaS service that could be delivered either in the cloud or on-premise so that you can have a private cloud version of this that could be used to simplify infrastructure problems for people that are building complex web applications. And I say complex web applications very deliberately because as you sort of look across the market, more and more of what used to be thought of as middle-tier capabilities are moving into the web tier. And I think that's a trend that's going to accelerate with time. Do I think the middle tier is ever going to go away? Probably not. I mean, there's an appropriate place, and there's appropriate middle tier technologies like messaging, so on and so forth. But I think more and more of what was previously thought of as middle tier capability is moving into the web tier. And we're seeing a lot of essentially two-tier applications where you have a data backend, a web front end with no discernible or defined middle tier. We actually did a really interesting study a couple of years ago. We talked to 1,000 enterprises. We asked them about the last application they built. Now, we didn't want to know about sort of what their install base looked like or, that mainframe application they've had sitting around for 20 years or anything like that. We wanted to know about the last new application you built. And we framed the study up around the canonical three-tier applications, so middle, front end, back end. And what was really surprising was there were a very, very large number, much, much larger than we expected, of these two-tier applications, right? Forms over data is a very simple example of that, but some more advanced stuff as well. Now, this is not to say that the canonical three-tier application is going away. It was still the dominant trend when we did the study. But it's very clear that web is maturing as a technology, and we're seeing a lot more line-of-business type applications moving to the web tier. And really, that's what we're going after with websites. And so, you got this marketing stuff, flexible, secure, scalable, so on and so forth. I mean, fundamentally, this is about easing infrastructure problems, right? So as we think about what we built it for, the scenarios we were going after, there's really four sort of key scenarios that we're in particular building for. Now, this doesn't mean that you can't use it for other things. This doesn't mean that you have to use it for this. This means that as we make feature decisions, as we make choices in terms of what we build and how we build it, we're going to focus on these four scenarios. And the first scenario we call global web presence. This is essentially a large corporate web entity, right? GM.com, AmericanAirlines.com, so on and so forth. Really, we wanted to focus on these global scale-out web properties where you've got a relatively large corporation that has a need to host a website globally. And we want to make this an appropriate product for that. Now, this isn't to say that a small organization can't use it, but the feature decisions are being made with large organizations in mind, at least in terms of global web presence. The next area that we're going after is something called digital marketing campaigns. So there's a large and growing group of digital agencies, essentially people running ad campaigns that do these microsites, so on and so forth. And they really look a lot like ISVs as a matter of practicality. So they write a lot of code, they build a lot of applications, they host a lot of things in the web, and they have a need for some sort of dedicated hosting solution, usually backed up by some form of source control. And so this is really a microsite type scenario where you might want to have a version of a site that's up and you want to change the graphic on it very quickly. You integrate your hosting solution with your source control and the back-end data, and you're able to very quickly change a graphic or so on and so forth. So let's say whatever star du jour that you're using to support your brand, they get arrested for something unsavory. You can go and change the head that's sitting on the website relatively quickly and easily. What's really interesting to me is that these digital marketing agencies look a lot like ISVs. And for the web space, at least, it seems that the direction that we're moving is the traditional sort of web ISV is being replaced by this more sort of ad-oriented, campaign-oriented entity. This isn't to say, of course, that traditional web ISVs are going away, but these digital agencies are making more and more of a piece of the pie in terms of that market. The next area we're going after is business applications, and this is actually probably the most important piece of what we're doing. This is all about line of business applications moving to the web tier and adding capabilities to Windows Azure websites to make that more appropriate. And so feature investments you might see around business applications would be WCF and sockets, right? And so make it more appropriate and make it easier for you to do more line of business, sort of traditional application type activities inside the context of Windows Azure websites. As a matter of practicality, this probably means we're going to get a lot more flexible, or there'll be a lot more flexibility in terms of what you can do with the lightweight web role that sits behind Windows Azure websites. There'll be more customization coming over time, so on and so forth. As I said, WCF and sockets are good examples. There'll be other investments that are made there. But the goal is to allow you to host a fairly robust line of business application on Windows Azure websites to make it a credible sort of application hosting solution as well as a credible web hosting solution. And so there's going to be a lot of investment sort of along these lines over the next 6 to 18 months. It's very clear that we're sort of further down the path of web hosting, which is appropriate. You do the table stakes features first. But this is really where we want to go with it. Final set of scenarios to talk about are hosting scenarios. I don't know if any of you guys are on some of the MVP or some of the Azure NDA aliases, but there's been a lot of conversation going on recently about whether or not websites is an appropriate solution for the long tail, or whether it's something that's being positioned for sort of high-end businesses, so on and so forth. As a matter of practicality, there's a whole set of scenarios we're going after for hosters, where a hoster would take Windows Azure websites, they would deploy it inside their own internal infrastructure, and they deliver a solution on top of it. And as we think about the long tail, as we think about those commodity-type web hosting solutions, that's probably something that the partners are going to go after. I think that you're going to see the Azure-hosted version of websites and the offers that we put in the market are going to be more focused on business applications and sort of more complex tasks, so on and so forth. And you can see that a bit in the way we priced SSL and some other decisions that we made. This is not to say that there's not going to be a commodity sort of long-tail solution built on top of websites. It's just that it's probably something we're going to leave to our partners. Right? A, we're being good corporate citizens that way, and B, it allows us to focus on sort of more advanced scenarios. The other piece to talk about in terms of this hosting scenarios is that they're broadly applicable to private cloud. I don't know if you guys caught some of the buzz and the talk lately around this Azure Pack for Windows. But essentially what we've done is we built an on-premise version of websites and an on-premise version of a number of other pieces of Azure technology. And we're giving them away essentially as a management pack that you install on top of Windows. What this means is that you essentially have an out-of-the-box private cloud experience based on the Azure portal, using Azure runtime environments and containers on the back end, which in my opinion is actually the most important piece of cloud today, right? The fact that cloud gives you these lightweight execution environments that allow you to do things, interesting things, consistently across platforms, that's the really transformative thing about cloud. I mean, everybody goes on about services, blah, 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 blah. Fundamentally, the fact that we've moved towards these lightweight execution environments that we can duplicate across fabrics, whether it's a private cloud fabric or a public cloud fabric, that's profound. That really has a lot of implications for sort of the way the market looks moving forward, so on and so forth. 2 or 3 years ago, 10 years ago maybe, you talked about Windows and Linux, and fundamentally Windows and Linux were the two execution environments you talked about. It's a much, much more complex world today, right? You have lightweight containers like we use with Antares or Windows Azure websites. You have the web role, the worker role, so on and so forth. There's all these different choices in terms of execution environments, and I really think that sort of defines the cloud more than anything else, right? But fundamentally, what we're doing with this hosting stuff is we're giving this solution to hosters as a white box solution so they can deliver long tail stuff and maybe some more complex things. And we're giving it to you so you can deploy it in a private cloud. Back to that first slide when I talk about IT problems, the goal is to give you a web hosting solution out of the box, right? So if you're an IT guy, you don't have to worry about rolling infrastructure and building custom stuff. You've got something, essentially a package you can deploy that allows you to host these web workloads in a very scalable, efficient way, and then move those workloads to the cloud as appropriate or as not appropriate. Make sense? Okay. So a little bit about GA. I can't really tell you when GA is coming, though I can tell you that the reason I'm here rather than some of the more senior engineers is that they're working on escrow builds. So it's pretty close. In terms of what you're going to see in GA, we're going to do SSL, IP, and SNI. That just previewed this Sunday, actually, is when we drop that. That's going to be in full release here pretty soon. I'm actually going to show you, I'm going to deploy a cert, and we'll do an SSL website. It'll be fun. Anyway, we're also doing 64-bit processes, which is actually a pretty big deal, especially in terms of scalability. Autoscale is actually something we have not talked a lot about, but it's coming. That's going to be at GA. So you're going to have autoscale functionality out of the box at GA, which is really pretty, we pushed to get that in. It's not something we thought we were going to be able to get in. Better memory dumps and log streaming. That's just kind of table stakes type stuff. A lot of improvements in terms of monitoring. And finally, my favorite feature, which is instance flexibility. I don't know how much you guys have played with the tool, but right now, if you have a deployment in a region, and let's say you've moved that deployment from shared to reserved, if you go to add another instance in that region, you have to add it as reserved, right? Because of the way we've set this up, essentially everything in the region has to be the same type of either shared, reserved, so on and so forth. At GA, you're going to be able to actually select which pieces of an instance will be shared and which pieces will be reserved. And so you'll be able to do a lot more sort of web farmy type solution where you have some shared stuff, you have some reserved stuff, and you'll be able to sort of pick and choose which workloads move where and which pieces of your infrastructure scale and which don't. Make sense? Any questions about that? No? Okay. Like I said, GA soon. Can't really tell you when it is, though. So in terms of why you'd use websites, and this is a bit markety, I apologize. We're really focusing on business scenarios, web scale scenarios, integration with Visual Studio. I think we've got a really, really good story there. Faster time to market, agility, so on and so forth. And finally, this notion of flexibility. And so even though we talk about Visual Studio a lot, the demos that I show you are all going to be done in Web Matrix, right? And so there's a lot of tools you can use. There's a lot of choice in terms of frameworks. And we want to make sure that you have as flexible as possible in experience. And we don't want to force you down any particular path as you go to deploy. That's really sort of a larger theme in Azure. The idea that we give you as much choice as possible in terms of how you host and where you host. People talk a lot about lock-ins, so on and so forth. The work that we're doing to bring Azure services on-prem, the fact that we give you choice in terms of where and how you host, the fact that you're seeing a new commitment from us to things like PHP and open source, I think is really indicative of what we're trying to do with the cloud investments as a whole. And so why do we say ready for business? Obviously, the biggest thing is the 99.9% monthly SLA, 24/7 support. The SSL stuff takes us a long way down this path. Access to other Azure services, I think, is also something that needs to be mentioned. The fact that you can use caching and service bus and identity and all these other Azure tools as you build things on websites, I think is pretty fundamentally important as you think about scaling and doing these line of business type workloads. In terms of why we talk about worldwide scale, a single instance, I think this is a large instance, can handle over 1 million hits a day. It's actually almost double that. It's like, actually it's 1.3 million hits a day. 10 instances, on the other hand, can service roughly 99% of the websites on the web. Now, not all 99%, any one of those 99%. There's obviously some very large sites out there that you need more than 10 instances for. But the point is, when you go to the slider tops out at 10, right? Why did we top it out at 10? Because 10 large instances are going to handle most any website in the world. If you want more than 10, that can be arranged. You can call up support, and we can do some special stuff for you, and you can end up with more than 10 instances. If you want to build sort of a scale-out big web property that's going to have a lot of traffic, we'd love for you to do that. But that's not something that you'll probably do out of the UI. That's something that's going to be more of a custom deal. All instances are load balanced by default. One thing that'll be coming, not at GA, but sometime after GA, is we're going to do some work to make sure that you have a little bit more influence over how the load balancing works. And so that's a feature that's sort of on the list. Can't tell you when it's going to be delivered, but at some point we'll give you a little bit more influence over how the load balancer works, where traffic goes, so on and so forth. It's definitely one of those things that you need to do as you start to move into the line of business application space. Infrastructure always up to date. This is essentially the canonical PaaS value proposition. You don't have to worry about your infrastructure. It's taken care of for you. The thing that I actually like the most about the tool is if you go to the website, you deploy something, you can actually go in the configuration tab and you can control the version, what version of PHP you're using, so on and so forth. That's really, really useful. And for a guy that used to do old school IT stuff and run data centers, not having to go roll bits, it's just so nice. And really, that's what the PaaS value proposition is about for a developer, right? Is the ability to go have a very easy configuration process and control your infrastructure. And I think that we kind of poo-poo the PaaS stuff and you do a lot of hand waving there. It really is a pretty big deal to be able to do that kind of thing, right? Pay for only what you use. We just made some announcements in terms of we're moving the billing model so that you are billed per minute, I believe now, rather than per hour. You're going to see more investments along those lines. I mean, the goal is if you're using it, we will charge you for it. But if you're not using it, we don't want to be charging you for it, right? And so more granularity in terms of how you bill, how that works, that's going to be sort of the name of the game moving forward. So how do we talk about scale up and scale out? I kind of like this slide just because it's simple. Fundamentally, there's really two scale models for websites, right? The first scale model for websites is you can obviously do shared and you get more instances, right? And these might be small instances, they might be large instances, it really doesn't matter. Scaling out fundamentally is about adding instances to your service, right? So more VMs, more runtime environments to essentially host your application. Or you can scale up. This is the move from a small instance to a large instance, right? So you can add more horsepower to an individual runtime environment, and you can allow your application to do more, work more efficiently, so on and so forth, right? And so really the scale story here is one about additional instances or larger instances. And as we make the changes that we're going to make in GA around flexibility in terms of role, you'll be able to do that within region, right? So rather than having to have all reserved, you'll be able to have some shared, some reserved, so on and so forth, right? So there's a lot more flexibility in terms of how you scale moving forward. Make sense? So best Visual Studio experience, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this. There's some really good integration with TFS and Visual Studio. You can publish directly from the interface. It's really a pretty good experience. I think that we've got a fairly robust tool set there, and if you use it, generally people like it. If you don't use it, we're not going to force you to use it. And actually, I think that's the big deal for this slide. We kind of wave our hands about Visual Studio, and certainly we'd prefer that you use Visual Studio. We're not going to force you to use Visual Studio. And like I said, the demos I'm going to do, use Webmetrics for all those. And there's other tools you can use, Eclipse, so on and so forth, if you want to. Right? We're not going to force you down the Visual Studio path, even though we'll build a good story with TFS and Visual Studio. Actually, just how many people use Visual Studio? Yes? Okay. Maybe I should have spent more time on this slide. Maybe I should have built my demo with Visual Studio. Anyway, faster to market, pretty straightforward. This is the canonical PaaS value proposition. The idea that you can deploy your infrastructure very quickly. You have flexible deployment options in terms of Git, FTP, Web Deploy, TFS. Obviously, you've got a variety of tools you can use in terms of your development experience. Really, I think this becomes really interesting when you start talking about the on-premise offering, right? I mean, you typically associate faster deployment with the cloud, so on and so forth. The fact that we have these Azure Pack for Windows means that fundamentally you can get this same kind of time to market and ability to scale out and deploy infrastructure very quickly on your on-premise infrastructure, right? Very private cloud, obviously private cloud, but a very public cloud-like experience on your private cloud, using the same interface, the same portal, so on and so forth. And so the faster to market piece is a given with the public cloud, I think. It gets a lot more interesting now that you can apply it to the private cloud. Finally, open and flexible. This is obviously a story about PHP, Node, ASP, Python, classic ASP. There's a lot of work being done to make sure that we keep up with a lot of these frameworks. There's also a lot of conversations internally about, do we need to support the framework du jour? How quickly do these things pop up and how quickly do they go down? I think that you're going to find that we're committed to the list that we have right now, PHP, Node, ASP. You're going to see investment in that moving forward. You're going to see a lot more work in Ruby moving forward. I think over time, whether we decide to add a particular new framework is going to depend on a lot of variables. And we're certainly committed to adding anything that gets big, but I think that we're going to wait a little bit before we decide something gets big. Just because you don't want to get in this constant process of trying to add the new flavor du jour, and then that people start using something else and adding that, et cetera. But I think we have a fairly robust list right now. That said, if there's anything that you guys want in particular, I'd love to hear sort of feedback around things we aren't doing, frameworks we need to support, so on and so forth. Choice of database, pretty straightforward. Relational, non-relational, NoSQL, MySQL, Azure SQL. The gallery piece, I think, is really interesting. It's pretty powerful. When I do the demo, I'm actually going to use the templates from the gallery when I do it. It's quite nice to be able to do that. I actually go back, when I think about the gallery, to the private cloud solution, right? So if you're an IT shop and you're thinking about deploying this internally, you have a gallery experience built in. Like you can publish applications to your users, so on and so forth. There's obviously also the ISV experience around if you build a piece of software for this thing, get it in the gallery, you've essentially got a ready-made market. It's really pretty powerful. Just a bunch of stuff off the gallery. I don't think we need to look at a bunch of icons. So, state of the service. At this point, we've got roughly 90,000 subscriptions since June. It's actually a little bit higher than that. I haven't pulled the most recent numbers. That's about, I think that number's 3 weeks old. Really robust growth. The curve is very promising. We're servicing roughly 3.8 billion hits per month. That's on average. We've been higher. We've been lower. Just on average since June, 3.8 billion. We got 120K sites hosted. And the SLA has been above 99%, or 99.9%, even though we're in preview. Right? So it's doing well. Adoption has been robust for something that's in preview, and we are hopeful for what's going to happen post-release. Any questions about any of that? No? Okay. So those are the slides. Those are no fun. I'm going to do a quick demo now, and hopefully that'll be more fun. So how many people here have actually used websites? Okay. So a few. So what you've got here is the standard Azure portal, as you'd expect to see if you... this is bad. Now can you see it? Yeah. I can still fix a problem. Now, a little warning. As I do these demos, you're going to see at least 2 known bugs. They'll be fixed by GA. And I had authentication problems back to my Azure account in Redmond. And so it's possible that this thing might fail and I might have to go to a backup. We'll see what happens, but hopefully it'll work. So anyway, this is the standard website, or the standard Azure interface. You go into the portal, you got your websites. I've actually got 3 websites already created. You'll notice that these are in Northern Europe, North Central US, and East Asia. You'll notice that they're running. I've got subscription information, so on and so forth. If I go here, I can go to individual URLs for these things that I've already set up. And so here I've set up a site called Fourth Coffee. Right? This is one of the site templates that you can use. And so the way that I did that was I went to add a service. We're going to add a new website. We're going to do it from the gallery. We're going to drop on down to templates. And we're going to do bakery, which is this Fourth Coffee thing, right? It's essentially a template for a little web business type site or a little local business type site with the ability to do web ordering. And so we're going to call this Live Demo TechEd North America. How's that? Oh, that should be NA. We'll do it North Central US, though you've obviously got the ability to choose what region you want to drop it into. We're going to hit OK. and now it's deploying the bakery application for me. This is essentially a templated web app. It's got a database backend that's automatically deployed. This is all sort of packaged up for you. And now you'll notice that this is deploying as a reserved instance. The reason it's deploying as a reserved instance is that I deployed it into North America, North Central, and I already had a reserved instance in North Central. When we move to the GA, you're going to be able to have a choice in terms of whether you deploy that as a shared instance or as a reserved instance in North Central. Right now, I'm forced to do everything the same in North Central, right? So we're going to go. Here's our live demo. Got a little website all set up, carrot cakes, everything looks yummy. A little ordering, about us, everything you'd expect. Now, if you go to the actual instance here, you notice that you've got a screen that prompts you to install some tools. You can go ahead and drop this thing into Web Matrix if you want to do some editing. We're going to go ahead and do that. It's going to sync up with Web Matrix. I'm going to tell it that I want to edit a local copy because I'm not crazy. And it's going to go ahead and download this site. This site is actually going to appear under my documents and my websites. You can obviously change the root for that, so on and so forth. But essentially what it's doing is it's pulling all the content down from the the cloud website, dropping it locally so I can do edits, so on and so forth. Hit continue. And it'll configure. Now, you've got a similar experience with Visual Studio here. I've just chosen to use Web Matrix because it's free. Now, what's really interesting here is now I can go and let's look at the default, welcome to Fourth Coffee, so on and so forth. You got all your images here for your products, so I can see, here's my thumbnail for bread. What's really interesting is it's also deployed a database with this. And so if I drop down to this bottom left-hand tab, you're going to see my databases. So here's the bakery. Here's all the tables. Here's my products. Notice I've got all my prices. So let's say I want to change the price of carrot cake to $9.99 because carrot cake is yummy and we want to charge more for it. We'll commit the change. Going to go back to Files. We're going to hit Publish. Continue. It's publishing. We're going to go over here. We're going to refresh our site. Oops. Let's go back and make sure we saved it. Oh, yep, that's what I did. Thank you. There we go. Now carrot cake is $9.99. Thank you. So that's essentially a fairly basic editing experience you can publish, so on and so forth. What's more interesting is if you want to set up source control, right, and be able to do some versioning and so on and so forth. And so what we're going to do here is we're essentially going to set up source control for this application or for this website. Oh, if I can get the right tab. Set up deployment from source control, do local get repository. It's going to set up my local get repository. This is actually one of my favorite features. It automatically copies the connection stream for you, which is nice. We're going to go here. We're going to go home. Files, source control, get init. Now we need to set up a remote. This is going to be TechEd demo. We're just going to throw in our connection string there. We're going to add it. Hit OK. And now the first thing we need to do when we set up source control is we need to commit our changes. So do an initial commit. We're going to go here. We're going to say, call it IC for initial commit. Hit OK. And what it's doing is it's doing an initial commit and publishing a version up to websites, right? And so we'll give it a second to publish. It's complete. And now we can go back to our websites interface. And now you'll notice in deployments, we didn't deploy. Let's try that again. I didn't push, you're right. Ta-da. Wait a second, my little thing goes in a circle. So while it's doing that, you'll notice that we've actually got an active deployment. You can look at this, and you'll see the deployment was successful. The reason this is still going in a little circle, it's the first of those bugs I told you guys were going to see. The handshake here doesn't work properly. It's going to be fixed by GA. And so you've essentially got to close out of Web Matrix and go back in. We'll select our live demo. There you go. So first bug, it'll be fixed. But as you see now that I've pushed, we've got an active deployment up there. Now, let's say I want to go ahead and do some editing on this. And so I'll go back to Web Matrix, go back to my default, and let's say I want to change the name of the thing to Calvin's Tea. I'll select all sites or all files. I'll replace all. Now let's do it without the exclamation mark. Replace all. Let's save. And now we're going to do a push. And so we'll go back to our website. Oh, you know what? I didn't commit. Now we'll do a push. So now we've got two versions, right? And what's interesting is if I go to the live demo URL, it says Calvin's Tea, right? Which isn't really very consistent with the Fourth Coffee logo. So we're going to jump back. We're going to go to deployments. And we're going to redeploy. Yes. Boom. So now we're going to go to our URL. Welcome back to Fourth Coffee. Just on source control. It's all free, right? Well, I guess I'm using a reserved instance, so technically it's not free. But if I was using a shared instance, it'd be free, right? Now you can do a better experience or an equally cool experience with Visual Studio, Eclipse, so on and so forth, but obviously this is the Web Matrix version. Right. Any questions about that? Comments, thoughts? No? No? Okay. So as we think about scaling, I've shown you the Deployments tab. We obviously have a Monitor tab where you can track activity. So clearly we've been moving some data between the website and our on-prem libraries, so on and so forth, so you can see activity there. You can see data in, data out, CPU time. This is the configuration tab I was talking about, around where you can control the version of the particular framework that you're using. So change the .NET version, change the PHP version, change the platform. This is also where you go ahead and upload your certificate and manage domains, which we'll get to in just a second. Here's our scaling tab. So right now we're on a small core, 1 reserved instance. We can scale that up to 10 instances. If you want more than 10 instances, there's actually a mechanism for getting more than 10 instances, but it's essentially a service call. You have to call and we'll put together a custom offering for you, so on and so forth. So 10 is what you can do out of the website. But as I said, 10 will handle roughly 99% of the websites in the world. It's 10 large instances is quite a bit of capacity here. And then obviously you can control small, medium, or large, move from a 1-core to a 2-core to a 4-core, and varying levels of memory. There's talk, and I don't know when this is going to happen, but I expect you'll have more flexibility in terms of the size of machine that you use moving forward in the Azure infrastructure. That's not just a website statement, that's sort of an Azure as a whole statement. Though I'm not sure when those changes will be dropped or when you guys will actually see that, but it's certainly something that's in the works in the future. And finally, link resources if you wanted a database, so on and so forth. So the big feature that was announced on Sunday is SSL. In particular, SSL, SNI, or IP-based SSL. And what I've done is I've set up a prior instance in Northern Europe called TechEd Demo Backup Northern Europe. Clever name. And as you can see, we've got Fourth Coffee. It's the same site. I haven't made any changes here. Though I've done the same source control stuff on this as I did in the other one. So if you actually go to the instance, you can see got a couple of deployments that'll show up. This thing is running on 1 small core and reserved. And I was up very late last night making sure that the SSL certs were working. Actually, I was getting them from GoDaddy. That's what I was doing. Anyway, so if I want to make this site secure, and if I want to use an SSL cert with that, I'm going to go to Configure. And the first thing I need to do is I need to upload my certificate. Right? And so your certificate is going to come from some provider. You're going to get the certificate along with a password. There's usually a process for that. That process varies from provider to provider. But at the back end of it, you should have certificates sitting on your desktop like I do. We're going to look for my certs folder. It's a PFX. Then I have to type in a little password that's associated with it. Bang. We're going to hit OK. And now we've got a certificate with an expiration date, thumbprint, so on and so forth. It's as simple as that. Now, go ahead.
Yeah, keys you have to get from the server.
What now?
Don't you have to get a key from the server, like a machine key?
So there's an authentication. So we set up a C entry last night, and so it goes back and gets the key from the server.
From Azure.
Yeah. Yep. As long as you configure the entries properly, it should do it for you automatically. Yep. And so once you've uploaded your certificate, you need to do some bindings. So last night I went out and set up this Azure Websites demo domain on GoDaddy. It's actually where I got the certificate as well. Pretty straightforward. It's just a C entry. I'm going to choose the certificate I just uploaded, and I'm going to choose SNI SSL. because fundamentally that's cheaper. The price for SNI is essentially $6 per certificate. If you want to do IP-based, the price is $26 per certificate. It's the thing that's driving that price is essentially IPs. Surprisingly, or perhaps not surprisingly, when you build a scale-out sort of property like Azure, IPs are at a premium. And so SNI uses less IP resources, and so fundamentally it's easier for us to deliver. And so we've set that all up. We're going to go and hit save. It warns me that there's some price impact to making this change. So I actually thought we were going to hit another bug there, which is occasionally when you do a save on the SSL, you'll get an error message. Even though it'll actually go and save the change, so on and so forth, you'll get a little red bang down there. If you're playing with this, don't panic. Hit save again, and then go and check your cert status. And the cert status is actually you've made your binding, so on and so forth. It's just a problem in the UI. Yeah?
Are we good for wildcard?
Yes. Yeah, wildcard and intermediate are supported. I don't know about multi-alternate name. I know wildcard and intermediate are. Yeah. If you want to follow up afterwards, I'll get you an answer. Yeah. And so I've done my binding. And so now we're going to go back. We're going to go to our site. So same old site. We're going to go ahead and say HTTPS. And it might take me a refresh or two to do this because I just bound the certificate, but we'll see. Hit return. I waited long enough. We're secure. There's our Class 2 certificate. View our cert. We know who the authority is. And there you go. Now what's interesting is that the difference between IP-based and SNI-based SSL is that with one, you actually pass the host name non-encrypted, right? That's how you're able to have multiple sites behind a single IP. And the service that lets you do that is, let's go to Internet Options, Advanced, TLS. So I'm going to turn off TLS, which means that now I'm not able to pass that unencrypted host name. We're going to do a refresh, and it breaks. So I know I'm doing SNI there, right? I can go back, go to Advanced, turn it back on. Ta-da. We're back. SSL is as easy as that. The hardest thing about SSL, frankly, is actually getting all your domain entries right. And so when you go to set up your domain entry, there's a little message that tells you where you have to do the authenticate and what text you need to put in there. When you do the first DNS entry, you want a www wildcard when you do your C entry. And then you want your authenticate afterwards. There's actually a blog post that's coming up about it in a couple of days. It'll give you a little bit of guidance in terms of that piece of things. But honestly, through this whole process, like going to GoDaddy and getting my cert and setting up my DNS entry, it's the hardest part. All right, everything else is pretty straightforward. Any questions about that?
Yes. Yeah? Did you generate a CSR at some point then?
What now?
CSR? Did you generate a CSR? Certificate request?
Yes, yeah. The certificate, well, I did all that last night. Yeah. I didn't. I wasn't. So what happens is you do the CSR and then you come back and you get some you get 2 keys that you use to actually download the certificate and set the password, and that's a pretty cumbersome process. I wasn't gonna do that as a demo. Yeah. What now? What now?
The extended validation.
Yes. Yeah. Are you asking if they're supported? Yes. Yeah. So extended validation is technically intermediate, right? Yeah, intermediate is supported, yes. Any other questions? Though there's actually, I should call out, there's a bug with intermediate right now. It just got triaged a couple of days ago. And so I think that you'll probably see the fix in about a week. But you may see some errors if you try to do intermediate right now. Like literally the bug, like we were having dinner with an MVP the other night, and he called out the problem, and we filed the bug, so I'm not exactly sure when it'll get fixed. But it should be soon. Any other questions? Go ahead.
So when we start to look at web deployment in our organization,
Mm-hmm.
one of the deployment models that's supported, and I don't speak out to the ignorance of how.
So web deploy is supported, FTP is supported, Git is supported. It's interesting. There's a lot of conversations going on right now about web deploy, and so what the deployment strategy should be moving forward. There's always going to be multiple deployment options supported. The question is what deployment options will be on that list, and sort of what do we want the preferred path to be, so on and so forth. A lot of conversation going on about that right now. So actually, if you have any feedback, I'd love to hear it. Certainly, we're not saying that there's not going to be a commitment to web deploy or FTP or any of the stuff that we have out there. I think it's just there's ongoing discussions about how deployment should look moving forward. Yeah, it'd be great to talk. I'd love to get some feedback on that. Yeah. The good thing, I mean, the really neat thing about Azure in particular, I've worked on a lot of products at Microsoft. And like I said, I was an app plat guy and all that. The really cool thing about the cloud is the pace of development. We've talked for many, many years at Microsoft about finding a way to sort of get things out the door quicker, and it seems like we were always tied to that sort of Windows boat anchor around, you know, every 2 or 3 years. Can't do anything until it gets in Windows. The fact that we're developing for the cloud means that we can very quickly get things out the door. And in fact, you know, we've gone from an initial table stakes set of features back in June with a number of iterative releases since then to this current GA that's coming where we really have a pretty robust, from a feature perspective, set of features, right? And we've done it relatively quickly, much more quickly than I think would have been done in the past. And I don't know if you guys follow Scott Goo's blogs, but on a weekly or a monthly basis at least, you're seeing him, you know, drop information about this or that feature that's shipping. So the point is we're not waiting for a big bang release to ship individual features. As a team gets something done, kind of kick it out the door. You know, let people kick the tires. We get this feedback on intermediate not working. We can drop a quick fix and, you know, so on and so forth. It's a much more iterative process and allows us to be a lot more agile. The really cool thing about it, though, is the fact that we're bringing this stuff back on premise to Windows means that fundamentally the Windows cycle has changed. Even though we might only drop a version of Windows every year, let's say, right? The fact of the matter is that the Azure features that live on top of Windows, right, will iterate much more quickly, right? Now, will the Windows version of websites iterate, you know, every 3 months like we do for the web version? Probably not. There's going to be some disconnect in terms of the on-prem bits and the cloud bits. But the fact that the cloud bits are iterating so quickly means that the on-prem bits are going to iterate more quickly as well. So I'm not a System Center guy, and so I can't categorically speak to what they're doing. I know that they're putting a lot of investments in moving workloads. I can't tell you what the experience looks like. I'm sure it's going to be GUI-driven and all that good stuff. But if you want to tie out afterwards, I know some of the System Center guys. I can hook you up with somebody to answer the question for you. Yeah. There's definitely a lot of investment in hybrid management. I don't know the particulars of what they're doing to move workloads. Yeah. But you know what's interesting is that you can, in fact, one of the guys on the Catal was the code name for the Azure Pack. So one of the Catal guys did a demo yesterday, I think, where they actually did source control for both on-premise and the cloud and pushed it at the same time. And so they took a version of a website and they pushed it to both places, which is just wow. And that's really cool stuff. And so there's some of that you get out of the box, just out of the Azure portal and the Azure tools. There's other stuff that you're going to do around System Center. And a lot of that depends on sort of the application model and how heavy the workload is. I mean, fundamentally, all of this stuff is predicated on the ability to model this application, you know, in some meaningful way, and to make sure that you deploy individual components, you know, that scale independently with one another and intelligently and all that good stuff, right? Which is something I'll talk about when I get to the architecture section. Any other questions about the demos? No? Okay. So on that, and thank you for calling out all the stuff I missed. And the screen's working. So how it works. So fundamentally, this is going to follow a lot of the nomenclature that you heard us talking about around the cloud and Azure in general, right? It's all cloud first by design. So this stuff is all designed for Azure in Azure, and then it's taken on-prem. There's some significant advantages in doing that in terms of scalability, in terms of redundancy. I think it's interesting when you talk about cloud applications. All the stuff we talked about for SOA applications, back in the early 2000s, and everybody kind of, oh, SOA. It's interesting. We get all that stuff sort of out of the box now, right? It's just sort of a basic benefit of cloud. And what's interesting is back when SOA was first talked about, it didn't shine and it wasn't adopted widely because fundamentally it was running on top of sort of tightly coupled infrastructure that tended to fail. And so if you build this application that has all these nice redundancies in it and you still run it in infrastructure that's at some level substandard, you really don't, sort of the benefits don't shine through. What's interesting now with the cloud is we have this redundant infrastructure on top of this redundant application architecture, and that's where it starts to really shine. And so nobody talks about SOA in the context of cloud or so on and so forth, but really when we talk about cloud first by design, we're really talking about designed for this scale-out infrastructure and designed essentially with what used to be called SOA in mind, right? Yeah, a little interesting aside there. It's all SQL-based configuration, so all the configuration stuff on the back end is kept in SQL. Dynamic provisioning of sites, and so there's a whole infrastructure designed to scale out the hosting infrastructure for you on demand. I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. It's all network-based storage, Azure X Drive fundamentally, and then there's intelligent load balancing built into it, both on the front end and when you get to IIS. And as I mentioned earlier, at some point in time, we're going to give you a little bit more visibility and a little bit more under the covers into what the load balancing looks like, and ideally a little bit more control of that with an API, though that's not final or anything like that. It's just something that's being talked about. So what does the architecture look like? I'm going to go ahead and just do the animation on this. So fundamentally, you've got an Azure front-end load balancer, right, that's routing your traffic. You've got a application request routing infrastructure there on the top. That's essentially an ARR library. You've got a runtime database that feeds into some deployment servers and an API front end. The deployment servers are essentially I don't want to say, what's interesting is in the on-prem version, the deployment servers are essentially System Center, right? And so we've replaced some of the cloud infrastructure with some on-prem infrastructure in the on-prem version, but it's the equivalent of System Center on top of Azure, right, to automatically deploy your web servers. The web servers are individual instances of something called the lightweight web role. We don't generally talk about that. It's a project that was done a while back. It's a scaled-down version of the web role. There's a trade-off that goes on between the ability to control your runtime environment and flexibility around your runtime environment. The more control you give to a runtime environment, the more responsibility you guys have in terms of having to manage it, and the less flexible it is, right? So we can either make a very inflexible runtime environment that you have no control over at all, right, that maybe doesn't allow you to do what you want to do, or we can make a very flexible runtime environment where there's a lot of control and suddenly you have a lot of management responsibility. And so there's a dynamic tension there around how much control do we give you of the individual IIS instance that you're running in versus how much do we lock it down. And so this is where things like WCF and sockets and so on and so forth, when and how do we want to add these to the runtime container, are interesting discussions internally. We're going to do all that stuff. We're going to enable you to have more control over the container. We're going to enable you to do a lot more line of business type things inside the container, but we need to find a way to do that, or we want to find a way to do that, or I should say we're going to find a way to do that, where you don't have a whole lot of management responsibility for the container. And a good example of that is, if you remember the screen during the demo, where I go and I have a couple of boxes I can click to decide, what I wanted, what version of .NET I want to use, right? Those kind of sort of sliders or that kind of an experience is probably the experience we're going to move towards as we start giving you more control over the runtime environment in the container. Right? There's a storage controller that lives under this thing with a cloud drive in back of it, and then obviously the website DBs on top. There's I think a 20, don't quote me on this because I don't have the numbers in front of me. I think there's a 20 gigabyte. There's a SQL database that's free with the offer at GA. And so there'll be some amount of SQL that'll come free out of the box that you can use with your applications. I'm not sure exactly what the offer is, but you'll see it at GA. Right. Make sense? Any questions about this? No? Go ahead.
At the way that it's currently set up, how many administration power do you have for each web server to get spins from it? Or is that some sort of abstract?
Completely abstracted. Yeah. So these are individual, like I said, they're instances of a lightweight web role. And this goes back to the conversation earlier around fundamentally the cloud is about runtimes, right? It's about the execution environment for your application. And so we built a lightweight execution environment that's based on IIS. You can imagine that we can have a slider in terms of how much control over that environment we can give you. Right now, we don't give you a whole lot. Over time, we'll give you more as we start moving towards these line of business type scenarios. But there's going to be a balance around we don't want to end up being the web role, right? Because fundamentally, the web role, there's quite a bit of management involved in the web role. And so we want to avoid that. We want to avoid you having to have a bunch of scripts that execute after you pull up your instance of the web role to get all your custom stuff in there, right? Ideally, we'd like to have some sort of GUI-driven experience where you can go and you can click a bunch of things that will automatically be installed when the instance comes up, right? And that's pure speculation on my part. Like, I can talk categorically about what's coming in GA. Anything after that, it's on a list and it'll be prioritized and we'll work on it as we have time.
So we've got about 12 deployments right now in web roles, and we got that spread across about 30 or 40 instances.
Okay.
But our code is very tightly controlled and optimized, so we're actually doing everything on extra smalls. This looks like something that I would like to move us to, but it appears that the shared is not exactly equal to an extra small. Because in other words, the extra small, we actually have our set memory footprint. Yeah. How does this really compare between those two?
I don't know off the top of my head. They should be the same. That should be the answer. And I thought that was the answer, but if you're having a different experience, then clearly that isn't the answer.
Well, I know for sure that the shared is 512 meg around, but the extra small are 670.
So I can say that there's been talk about more flexibility in terms of what we offer in terms of reserved instances. And so it's possible that at some point in time in the future, you'll have an extra small reserved instance. And if we did build that, then that'd be a really good alternative to shared. But I can't, I'll have to follow up with you on that, unfortunately. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah, so there's really two deployment models right now, and unfortunately, because I already set up some VMs for the SSL stuff, I couldn't show it to you. When you first deploy, you end up with a shared instance, or generally you end up with a shared instance, and that's essentially a VM, right, or essentially a VM that's shared between you and a number of other people, and it's been partitioned so that you get a portion of the VM resources, they get a portion of the VM resources. When you move to reserve, you end up with a dedicated VM. Right? And I say VM, it's really a runtime environment. It's a runtime container is what it is. But let's just call it a VM because that's a nice, easy term that everybody understands. So you end up with this VM, right, that is of a particular size, that has a particular amount of memory, a particular number of processors, that is yours. Nobody else is on that, right? And so, reserved is fundamentally if you don't want to worry about nosy neighbors, if you want to guarantee performance, it's much easier to guarantee an SLA on reserved than it is to guarantee an SLA on shared, right? Because fundamentally with shared, you partition a VM, but you still have to deal with or worry about the other people on that VM. So there's only so much bandwidth in the VM, for example, right? And even though you've only given them some portion of the processing power, they might hog a lot of the bandwidth, right? And so it's actually an interesting discussion internally we have around how do you guarantee SLA and shared, and sort of what does that look like from a business perspective moving forward? Do we maybe want to go to extra small as a replacement for shared, right? If we had a robust extra small offering, why do you need shared, right? There's interesting discussions to have there. Now, obviously no decisions have been made, and we'll see what happens. But right now, shared is you're sharing a VM with somebody. Reserved is you've got a dedicated runtime environment for yourself. Yeah. So Windows Azure Websites has an on-prem version that comes with the Azure Pack for Windows. In fact, there's two execution environments that come with the the Azure Pack for Windows. One is the VM execution environment, which is essentially the IaaS solution on-prem. The other is the websites solution, which is essentially the web hosting solution on-prem. You get the equivalent of this environment. You have a load balancer, you've got deployment infrastructure on-premise when you deploy the Azure Pack. And so you have actually, and I probably should have done this for the demo, I'll do it next time, you have the same portal. So that portal I just went to where I deployed an instance and all that sort of stuff, you can surface that to your end customers with the Azure Pack. Right? And so it becomes literally a self-service private cloud experience out of the box. And you can choose, I mean, if you don't want to offer them extra large, you don't have to offer them extra large. I mean, you've got some flexibility in terms of some control over what kind of offers you can do. But I actually had dinner with the guy that, one of the guys that owns Catal last night. And I guess like Harvard Business School has deployed Catal. And that's the Azure Pack for Windows. And they're using it to, people, they've got all these little web applications that people build. And now you just go to a website, you self-service, you pull up an instance, you deploy your application, you're done. Right? And IT manages this packaged private cloud environment now for them. Actually, I don't know if it might be the local business unit. I don't know if it's actually IT that's deployed it, but anyway. Make sense? Yeah. Any other questions? No? So I got a few more slides. So session summary, we don't need to talk about this. It's scalable, secure platform deploying web workloads. Woohoo! Okay. There's actually a bunch of other sessions. Now, since I'm 8:30 in the morning on the last day, most of these have already been done. But you can actually go and download the decks. They're available on the site. And so I don't know if you caught all these sessions. If you didn't, these might be places that you want to go and look at the recordings. The Ryan Jones session, I think the websites for Windows Server session is the one where he did the demo where he did the source control and deployed to both on-premise and the cloud from the single instance. It's worth watching. And so you guys can get a car. I hope one of you wins. If you do, will you give me a ride? And Channel 9, all the stop resource stuff. And of course, do an evaluation. Try not to be too harsh. So any final comments, thoughts? By handle disaster recovery, do you mean? So the cloud environment it should be immune to that. So this is all scale-out infrastructure. There's multiple instances of everything. Like you shouldn't have to worry about disaster recovery. We do have some site-level disaster recovery. So there's a plan in place if some disaster were to happen in the Chicago data center, right, where we can do some recovery. And that would be like a larger sort of Azure recovery story. But if you deploy this into Azure, you shouldn't have to worry about any sort of hardware failure. It's all redundant hardware. The storage it's like triple redundant storage, like so on and so forth. And so you shouldn't have an individual instance fail because of a hardware issue. Like that, you just should be immune to that. Now, there are occasionally service issues. And so there was a thread last night, I guess, once an hour as you load some of the DNS resources, like response time drops a little bit. And it's a bug. They're looking into it. I'm not gonna promise you that there's not going to be anything from a service level that ever interferes with your site's performance. There's certainly things that we're working out there. But from a hardware perspective, you shouldn't have to worry about a disaster. Yeah. Go ahead.
In the keynote, Brad Anderson talked about a mainland China data center.
Indeed.
Would that become available here?
I do not know the delivery schedule for that, which I should because I'm on all the mail threads on it be delivered. It's called Mooncake is the internal project for that. And it's soon. I think this summer, but don't quote me on that. Yeah, it's very soon. Like let's put it this way, it's going to be done by Christmas. I hope I didn't put my foot in on that one, but.
And if I wanted to do a cost analysis to move from a physical data center to this type of environment, where would I go to try to determine?
It's interesting. I'm actually working on an ROI calculator that is supposed to be released at launch. We'll see if I get it done or not. But there's some online ROI calculators already out there where you can compare costs. I will give you one word of warning. The ROI thing is smoke and mirrors. Fundamentally, a well-run private cloud on-prem probably delivers infrastructure just as cheaply as a well-run cloud offering. Really, you move to the cloud for convenience, agility, so on and so forth. I've seen very few people that have really seen a lot of savings, unless it was a really just badly run environment, frankly. You do cloud because of new capabilities. You do cloud because of the ability to do interesting stuff. I'm friends with the chief architect at EasyJet, and they're one of our partners for the service bus and stuff like that. And they've got a really, really great case study where they went and added seat reservations to all their stuff. And they didn't do it because they were going to save money or anything like that. They did it because they have this sort of billing process that's just some billions of dollars every month goes through it. And making changes to it and doing brain surgery on it is fundamentally a big deal. Like it's expensive and it's risky. It's not even so much that it takes so much time to do the coding and everything. It's that there's so much risk involved in doing the coding. And so they wanted to pilot this whole notion of adding seat reservations. And they didn't want to do brain surgery on their core billing system. And so what they did was they spun up some Azure instances, some website instances, and they surfaced a little widget on their website. So they freed up some real estate on the website. And essentially, the website ends up with this little gadget there where you can go and select a seat. And then they used Service Bus and some other technology to pass the seat number back to their billing database. And so essentially, all they did was they added a table in the billing database and a secure connection via Service Bus to this web service that sits in Azure, right? And they can then call out that the seat's reserved. They did this whole thing. They didn't have to buy any. The hardware bill. It was going to be like some millions of dollars worth of hardware if they wanted to do it on premise. Like no hardware had to be bought. Relatively small development effort. Spun up this web service, tested it out, made the single table change to their database, wired it all up. Turns out their customers really like not having to run and push people out of the way for a seat. And so in order to scale this thing, they moved to Slider, and they scaled up the web service. And now they're doing seat reservations across, I think, a majority of their flights. And they avoided a bunch of on-premise hardware spend. They avoided a lot of risk in terms of doing brain surgery on their sort of central billing system. And they ended up with a scalable hybrid service that lives in the cloud that they could expand based on customer demand very easily. But what's interesting is if customers hadn't liked it, right? If they, I love shoving that guy out of the way for a seat, right? That's like the best part of my day. So I don't want to reserve a seat. They could have turned it off. And they only lost a little bit of dev time. They didn't have a bunch of hardware sitting in their data center they weren't going to use. That's why you use the cloud. Like that fundamentally new capabilities, like Service Bus to connect, disparate environments, and the ability to have this sort of web service that scales not linearly, but independently of your backend billing database, and the ability to avoid having to make a bunch of changes to complex, entrenched on. That's why you use the cloud, right? But that said, I'll have a billing or a little ROI calculator for you. Any other questions? No? So this is good, bad? You like what you see? You want to see more? Any feedback? No? Thanks. All right, well, thank you for your time. If you got any questions, feel free to follow up after the session, and I appreciate you coming.